Good evening, everyone. Hello there, my name's Alan Miller. Welcome tonight. I'm one of the directors of the New York Salon. It's great to have you here with us. You'll meet Jean Smith in a minute. She's the other director of the New York Salon, sat there in the middle of the panel. I just wanted to say a couple of things before we get straight into the discussion tonight. For quite a few years now, the New York Salon has very luckily had a relationship with the New School, and we'd like to thank Pam Tillis and David Scobie as well for that. We've done a number of interesting events, which have also been part of our relationship with the Battle of Ideas International Festival. Some of you will have the brochures on your chair. The Battle of Ideas is now just in its 9th year. It's a 2-day festival in London with over 450 international speakers, several thousand attendees, with 70 sessions, with everything from discussions on technology to poetry, from free speech to the culture wars. And the International Satellite Festival was founded 4 years ago to expand that festival internationally. And so now in its 4th year, this is the 28th session out of 35 over 2 months, which ranges from being in places like Lisbon, Athens, Oslo, Zurich. There's one tonight actually in Brussels, where it was earlier on because of the time difference. New York City, of course, and many, many in the UK and across the rest of Europe. So someone mentioned to me tonight, actually, because obviously it's the elections in New York, that a friend of theirs has said that, you know, are you voting? And you really must vote. And when my friend asked them why they should vote, they said, well, anyway, I don't know, but you just should. And in a way that speaks to maybe one of the issues that we've identified at the New York Salon about, you know, ideas and the importance of them because they have consequences, and perhaps that we need to struggle more and interrogate ideas a little bit more and question them in the spirit of understanding things rather than just doing things, So that's the spirit in which we at the New York Salon are engaged in this festival with the Battle of Ideas. And if you want to tweet tonight, it's hashtag Battle of Ideas. You can all do that. And now I'm going to hand you over to Jean Smith. Thank you very much.
Okay. Don't clap, it just encourages him. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and thank you to the New School. And I would also like to thank all of the New School volunteers, including the people that are doing the filming. Just so that you're aware, we are filming the event, so if you stay, I'm assuming that you're giving your consent to be filmed, you know, which is great. So we first started having a conversation with the New School about putting on these events about a year ago, which, as you'll all know, is, you know, we're coming up to the 1st anniversary of the shootings at Sandy Hook. And at first we were thinking, well, you know, maybe we'll just do something on gun control, gun violence, etc. But then the more we thought about it and the more we started to discuss it, it seemed that there was something more important going on just in terms of, you know, these, what you may call these random acts of male violence. And I think as well, it's a more difficult discussion. But what we're hoping to get out of the conversation this evening is just look at, you know, what's going on. Look at these events. What do they represent? What can they tell us about contemporary U.S. society? And also, what can they tell us about, you know, the citizen and our interpretation of the citizen in democracy, you know, today? And so, you know, I'm hoping that's going to come out of the discussion. And this is going to be an in-conversation format. So I'm going to ask the speakers various questions, and they're going to answer the questions. We're going to have some back and forth, etc. And that's going to be for about 50% of the time. And then the other 50% of time, we will come out to the audience, and there'll be plenty of time for the audience to participate. So you don't have to think of a question. If you have something to say, you can just say it. You don't have to frame it as a question. So no matter how eager you are to respond to one of the speakers, please, you know, control yourself, because there will be plenty of time for, you know, discussion. And it's one of the things that's really important, not just because we want everybody to be able to say what they think, but because it's the only way we can really further the discussion if we have as many different points of view, you know, in the conversation. So first of all, I'm going to introduce the speakers to you. and they're fortunately sitting in alphabetical order. So on my far left is Patrick Egan, who's the Assistant Professor of Politics and Public Policy at NYU. Next to Patrick is Nancy McDermott, who's a writer and advisor to the Park Slope Parents, New York City's most notorious parents organization. Then on my right, although I don't think politically, is Claire Potter, who is a professor of history at the New School. And then on my far right, and the jury's still out on that, is Christine Rosen, who's a fellow of the New American Foundation and senior editor of New Atlantis. And you can read their full profiles online on our website, which is nysalon.org. So if you could please all thank the speakers. So now we've got the clapping out of the way. We don't have to do any more clapping, which is good, until the end. So my first question, and I think I'm going to start with Claire, is that it does seem that over the past 20 years, violent crime in the US appears to be down. And it seems that violent crime using guns is down. And yet at the same time, we have these random acts going on. Most recently, we had the act in New Jersey last night, which didn't result in a lot of people getting injured. It was the individual himself who ended up committing suicide. But we have these random acts of violence done by individual males. So my question is to you, do you think these acts have anything in common? What do you think that they represent, and can they tell us more in terms of what's going on today?
Yes, thank you, Jean. First, I'd like to say that the drop in violent crime has a great deal to do with incarceration. All right, the United States now has some of the highest incarceration rates in the nation. Millions of people are in prison. So the drop in crime has been a function of that. When we look at these, as we say, random crimes, for me, it's very hard to think of them as random because, in fact, they are a pattern of violence that we're trying to understand. I think they have a number of things in common, and I think there are probably three things we ought to be looking at right now. One is the capacity to spread information about these crimes, to create narratives or stories about these crimes that are easily communicated across social media. Often those stories are wrong. There was a wonderful story in The New Yorker about the rapes in Steubenville, Ohio. A football team or members of a football team were involved in raping a woman. And the story was about how the tale of this rape got out over social media and how the story was really wrong, all right? So we have stories about gun violence being produced that are fitting a certain pattern. They go out very quickly over Twitter, over blogs. There's a vast media environment that needs content to fill it. Okay, so I think that's one thing we need to be looking at. The second thing I think we need to be looking at is masculinity. And although this may seem unrelated to you, I'm thinking about the incident over the weekend on the Miami Dolphins in which Jonathan Martin, a lineman, apparently was teased so relentlessly by his teammates, but apparently had one particular tormentor that he finally just snapped. But instead of snapping and killing someone, he walked out of the dining hall and went to his psychiatrist. All right, so he'd obviously been seeing somebody about this. And I thought that was a very poignant story, both because here's somebody who did something right, okay? He had access to treatment, he had access to help, and he sought help. And nobody connected that thing to these other things that have been happening. But it was also a very poignant story because I think we don't talk enough about masculinity in this culture. And about subcultures of masculinity in which men are cruel to other men. And I would just close by saying one of the things that all of these shooters have in common is everybody refers to them as quiet. He was so quiet. He was so quiet. These are people who are trying to disappear. And there's very little thought about why they're trying to disappear. What happened to them that made them want to disappear?
Thank you. Patrick, what do you think about that?
Well, I think I agree with a lot of the themes that Claire was mentioning. One thing to sort of keep in mind, first of all, is that the jury is still out on whether the number of these mass shootings has actually increased over the last 20 or 30 years. We're certainly hearing a lot about them over the last, say, 18 months. But if you look at, say, FBI statistics on mass shootings, and they actually do keep statistics on mass shootings, which they define as incidents in which 4 or more victims were killed, there's actually no discernible increase in the rate of those killings per year over the last 3 decades. So one question that then arises is why the focus on that now? And I think Claire very definitely talked about how social media and the rise of the internet is perhaps fueling some of the talk and coverage of these incidents. But I think we also have to keep in mind that it's taking place against a very real decline in violence and Americans' fear of violence. So not only is our murder rates down, our violent crime rates down, but it's also the case that if you ask Americans, are you afraid to walk around your neighborhood at night? The share of Americans who say yes is at its lowest point in 40 years. So I think part of the story is that there's such a gulf between the everyday experiences of many Americans in terms of their experience with violence, which is pretty low, not compared to the rest of the world, unfortunately, but very low in terms of recent U.S. history, and the explosive and gripping nature of these incidents as they get played out on TV and other media.
Oh, thank you. Christine.
I think Pat makes a very good point. I also agree with several things Claire said. The actual statistics on the mass shootings at the Bureau of Justice Statistics had from 1980 to 2008, the number of mass shootings as a percentage of all gun deaths was less than 1%. So less than 1% of all gun deaths are these mass shootings. But you're right, we absolutely hear about them in an endless loop on cable news and on social media when they happen. I think one thing I'd like to hear us talk about tonight, and hopefully in the audience you have some suggestions for this too, is that in addition to this issue of the mass media and social media and this question about masculinity and why these crimes tend to be committed by men, is I actually think our consumption of media about these sensational stories is part of our everyday experience. If you look at how much media and television use Americans on average consume every day, I don't think we can really separate and say, well, we like walking around our neighborhood, but then we go back and sit in our houses and watch, frantic cable news programs. That's also part of our everyday experience, and I think that speaks to a different kind of cultural anxiety. It is a kind of fear, but it's part of a broader cultural shift away from fear of, we want 100% safety, right? I mean, I recently, I have kids and they have these car seats that, honest to God, you could send them to the moon in. They're so safe. It's ridiculous. And the box comes with all these warnings. My pizza box comes with warnings about safety. I'm like, it's a pepperoni pizza. It's not going to kill me. Unless I eat too much of it, I guess, and that's a whole other issue. But this need for someone to take responsibility when something fearful happens, I think is important. The old historical anecdote was that I think Mark Twain told at one point was, a steamboat sunk, and the headline in the newspaper the next day was, steamboat sinks, hundreds die, no one to blame. That would never happen these days, right? So we do, I think, as well have this culture of problem fixing combined with an anxiety and a need for 100% safety that also feeds into the way that these narratives develop over mass media when one of these shootings occurs.
Nancy.
Right, well, I want to back up a little bit because the way I see these shootings is I see them as a product of a society that is in crisis. I mean, when you think about it, it may not seem obvious, but think about just about every institution you can mention, you can think of, from Congress to the Boy Scouts to, I don't know, the family. All of those institutions are now up for question, up for discussion, and it's very difficult to, rely on the old social landscape that existed. And I think that generally in societies where there are those sorts of tensions, you do have does happen that certain individuals will snap. And the question that I think is more interesting is not so much, do they snap? Because I think this is something that happens throughout history. But why is it that it takes the particular form that it does today? I mean, another example of this would be the Salem witch trials, and the fact that at that particular time in American history, the way that people snapped was to believe that they were being afflicted by Satan. And so I think that this is a similar phenomena. I mean, sometimes it's called a social script. And I think that's where the commonality between these events comes from, is that this is now the thing that you do when you snap. It's a social script. And I suppose that the interesting thing about it is that it is so violent, and it's also so nihilistic. I mean, it's also interesting how it seems to have taken on an international dimension. I mean, I think you could argue that it's not just the Boston bombings that bear a resemblance to school shootings, but actually the attacks in the mall in Kenya. This kind of attempt to go down and take as many people with you as you can. So I think that's a good starting point for this, is to try and understand, you know, what are the forces that are giving rise to this particular behavior.
Do you agree with that, Claire?
I do and I don't, to tell you the truth. I think a social script is another kind of story we tell ourselves, and it's easy to sort of fit similar incidents into it, and it's easy to overlook other kinds of phenomena. I mean, for example, the police are dramatically more violent now than they were. And I'm sure, you know, I don't have the statistics to show more police are killing more people, but I'm thinking about the woman who, for example, crashed her car into a barrier outside the White House and was chased by the Capitol Police, and they gunned her down in her car in front of her child. There was something wrong with her. Voices were telling her that she had to get to the president and so on. But the automatic response was to go after her with lethal force. I think one of the things that's interesting about these incidents is if, let's say, there's a social script for the gunman, there's a social script for the police now too, which is they go after this person with all the force at their command. One of the things that's unusual about the Boston bombing is that one of the culprits actually lived through the police assault. Someday there will be a story from him about why he did what he did, but there's almost never a story from these people. They are a complete mystery to us, and they become this kind of blank canvas onto which we can then paint our story of why these crimes are occurring.
I think that's a very interesting point. I was reading an article the other day that said that, in fact, things have meaning because of the meaning we give to it. So I want us to explore that a little bit in terms of the way we respond to these events, bearing in mind, you know, the point that Nancy made about the social script, but in terms of the way we respond as individuals, the way the media respond, and also the way the authorities respond. Because you may remember that after the Boston bombings, a section of Boston was completely shut down. And in fact, the perpetrator was only found after the lockdown, and he was found by a member of the public who then, did what you would expect the person to do. So, let's explore that a little bit in terms of our response to these events and how much our response is influencing, these events. So, Patrick, do you want to come in on that?
Sure, yeah, I would say that I have two kind of reactions to that question, which I think is a really interesting one. I mean, I think the first is asking how an event gets framed as a terrorist act is kind of a fascinating thing. So we, I think in the end, decided as a culture that the Boston bombing was a terrorist act by two guys who, I can't remember, at least one of them was an American citizen, I think,
Yeah.
right? And this was determined in part by, you know, the kinds of things they had written on a Facebook page or something, but it was certainly not connected with any kind of, you know, international terrorist organization or what have you. But it seems to be what I think kind of is sort of fascinating is to contrast that with something like Sandy Hook, which you know, certainly had much more devastation. Many more people died. I think it's a much more devastating kind of incident than Boston, and was not framed as terrorism, obviously, because it was pinned to this one guy who was, as we've been saying all night so far, these sort of quiet loners who happen to have a lot of guns. And you know, what you see happening in politics is if something is framed as a terrorist act, then conservatives get really kind of lathered up about it. And if it's framed as sort of one of these lone gunman kind of thing, then liberals get really lathered up about it, right? And what we don't kind of think about is where does that frame come from? And how does the frame get set? Because it seems to sort of evolve over time, and then it gets kind of gelled, right? It gets crystallized. And so the response, I think, has so much to do with our interpretation of the meaning or the intent of the actor, and it's something that I think we still don't know enough about.
Mm. Right, right. So what are your thoughts on, you know, the point that Nancy was making about, you know, there is a social script which we're trying to come to terms with, and that kind of, you know, draws all of these things together. Do you think that's true, or do you think these are kind of random, unconnected? And I suppose the other thing, you know, that I think is important as well is the way, you know, it seems now that every time somebody does something bad, in the old days you'd say, well, that person did a very bad thing. Whereas now there's increasingly the case that people pathologize bad behavior. So they say, well, that person was mentally ill, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So do you have some thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, so one thing that we really care a lot about in social science is whether we can determine whether something is essentially random. Because what you want is something like weather, which is essentially random, and then you can be sure that any correlation you see with something like weather or anything else you can be sure is random is actually causal and not just correlation, right? Well, I would be very, very confident and very very comfortable declaring these mass shooting events as essentially random. That essentially somebody's, you know, some god is rolling a giant 24-sided die, and these things happen. They pop up here and there. We can't predict when they happen. Certainly we can't. And they don't seem to happen in any particular kind of place. They happen in blue states, red states, cities, suburbs, exurbs, et cetera, right? And so we try to make sense of them, and with, you know, the idea of a script or the idea of telling a narrative about these people. But I think for our purposes, it's best as a culture and also as experts who are trying to prevent and respond to these events to treat them as essentially things that happen and things that unfortunately we can't do a whole lot about.
What do you think about that, Christine?
Well, I think that's right, and I think perhaps one of the reasons we focus on these lone random events and then try to impose a narrative or script on them is because in some ways that's easier than dealing with the reality, which is that 2/3 of all gun deaths are suicides. So how do you deal with suicide? That's a much harder thing to put a script on, right? And it's hard to prevent, but that is actually where death is occurring at a much higher rate than in malls with a random shooter. I think if we could cast ahead into the future a little bit, you know, with all the NSA spying scandals and everything, you know, you hear a lot of the justification is safety, protection, we need to do this. I think we're not that far out from seeing that happen more at a domestic level. If you look at what's coming, it's already in existence in some police departments, but we have a lot of predictive policing technologies now, algorithms that you can run through your system and figure out which street corner is more likely to see a crime committed on certain times of day, certain days of the week. There are police departments already using that. So why not combine, say, for example, I mean, someone once asked me, how do you predict one of these mass shooters? And I said, well, look at his Facebook page. which in fact, there are clues. That's the first place everybody goes, Twitter feed and Facebook. When a shooting happens, they looked at the Twitter feed of the Boston bombers. And the truth is there are sometimes clues there, and we have algorithms we could use to search through everybody's, stuff, which might in fact already be getting done by our government. But I think and this of course is my dystopian nightmare. I'm just explaining that this is likely possibility in the future. But I think, again, it's driven by an anxiety, a need to control what's going on, and an uncomfortable inability to deal with risk. And we live in a society that is very risk averse. Ironically, our day-to-day behaviors are quite risky in some cases. But so I think to square that circle, yes, they're alone and random, so it's hard to prevent, so we have a script. But what about all the things that we do know a little more about that we avoid trying to deal with because those scripts are harder to write?
Can I jump in on this just for a second? Do. I mean, I'm uncomfortable with the idea both. And I understand that my friends here are not saying this, but in a way it's sort of coming out as like, well, this is actually normal. This is the state of play. And it's only normal if you're thinking about the United States. If you're thinking about the rest of the world, it's not normal. All right, so that different countries have different contexts for their violence. I spent a lot of time in South Africa, and there is tremendous violence in South Africa, but it's not like American violence at all. There are some countries where you don't actually see many gun deaths at all. So I think if we look at it solely in an American context, we actually normalize the situation. I think the second thing, and this is actually starting to make me nuts, every time one of these things happens, some politician gets up and says, we have to make sure this never happens again. And it's just like, oh, please, But in fact, there are all kinds of policy decisions we have made as a nation to ensure that it does happen over and over again. We have defunded mental health. We have created a public school system where there are between 30 and 45 children in a classroom, in which students literally can disappear because there is nobody in that school. I mean, my nephews went to a school in New Haven where nobody actually knew whether they were there or not. They could be truant for days at a time, and sometimes were. And nobody at school knew. No teacher ever reported it. So we have, created a situation in which there is no institutional structure within which young people in particular can be nurtured. And one last thing I would like to say is if anybody in this room has ever tried to get mental health services for a teenager, you know that that is almost impossible in this country. Almost impossible. So that when we talk about, how do these kids slip through the cracks, it's easy. Preventing the incident itself may not be possible, but laying a kind of policy groundwork that allows us to actually help young people when they need help and, keep them from becoming alienated and depressed and aggressive. I think we could do that.
I will jump in to say that then is going to butt up against Americans' distaste for having if we're talking about government policies here, government meddling too much in private decisions in the family, because a lot of these situations arise out of chaotic family situations or difficult family situations. So I agree with everything Claire's saying, but I do think then there is a resistance to that, a resistance to the government having a policy that's going to say, parents, you need to do this, this, and this because your kid's at risk. I mean, you can only do so much of that without, then you run up against liberty and freedom and a lot of the stuff that, I think we rightly hold
I
dear.
Agree with you.
Just hold on a second, because I just want to bring in Nancy on this.
Thank you. I think the thing that's important about our mental health laws is not, I actually think it's the problem will not be families being resistant to finding a way to deal with mentally ill teenagers or family members. I think the problem is that our mental health laws are based on the assumption that family members are not the people who can be trusted to identify when someone has a problem. So if you've ever been in the position of having to try and get help for someone, it's not enough just for a family member or even a family member and a doctor to say this person is a danger to themselves and a danger to other people. There are very specific criteria that you have to meet. And I actually think it's based on not trusting family members and doctors. And believe me, when someone has a mental health issue, the family members and their doctors are the first people who know, and the first people who are aware that there's a problem.
And I want to pursue this thing. I mean, what are we saying? Are we saying that whether or not we think there's a social script? Are we saying that these random acts are performed by people who, have some form of mental health challenge? Do you think that, Patrick?
I'm not an expert on those folks. It's certainly the case from what I read about these incidents. It seems like these are men, and they're almost all men, in a profound state of mental and emotional distress. That was certainly the case for the guy, the 20-year-old who killed himself in Paramus yesterday in New Jersey. Certainly the story that we saw at LAX, whenever that was, feels like it was just 24 hours beforehand or whatever it was. So I think we are, that seems to be a very 21st century way to talk about these men, and it's one that I think makes sense to me medically and socially. Whether I would connect it to something broad like the availability of mental health services, I'd be reluctant to do, just because if it's the case that these mental health services have become harder to get over the last 30 years, and I'm not even sure that that's true. For example, we've expanded Medicaid for kids at the national level through President Clinton's S-chip program, for example. So there's a lot of, we've also required insurance companies to cover mental health care at the same level as physical health care. That's a relatively recent development. But if it were the case that mental health care is not as easily available now as it was 30 years ago, then I don't know why we would be seeing such a huge decline in gun violence at the same time.
Right. Nancy, do you want to come in on that? And then I'm just going to move us on to a related topic.
Well, I mean, I just want to go back to the social script for a minute, because I think it's possible for acts to be unpredictable and for acts to be random. But it's more that the form that the act takes is what becomes a social script. And so it seems to me that I just don't feel comfortable with trying to say that there's no pattern here, because clearly it hasn't always been the case that when if someone has a mental health problem, that they act out in such a violent and antisocial way. And it seems to me that that's really kind of the thing that we need to get to grips with.
Right. I do want us to come back to this topic, but just before we come out to the audience, I want us to look at a related but slightly different theme. We had this conversation in London about a month ago as part of the Battle of Ideas Festival in London. And the audience, the big issue for them was the whole issue of Americans and guns. And you have to bear in mind that, the climate at the festival is not as anti-American as a lot of things that you could go to in Europe are. Never ceases to amaze me. I have people that don't speak to me now. I'm an American citizen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And these are all, quite open-minded people. But the audience were split down the middle in terms of their views on gun control. But particularly the younger people had quite a skewed impression of, the whole issue of guns in the US. So I suppose my question is this, and because we have these acts of violence, but then there's the broader conversation that comes out of these acts. Every time there's an act, this conversation comes to play, and that is the whole. So I suppose my question is whether or not the issue of gun control is becoming a part of the cultural divide in the US. The way people identify them, whether you're from a community where owning guns is just part of what you do. You own guns, they're part of the way you're brought up. you teach your children how to go hunting, etc., etc. And then there's another whole section of people, and that's just not part of their world at all. So my question is that, and maybe I'll start with Christine, who comes from a family where they did have guns in the house, whether or not you see this as part of a new cultural divide in the US.
It's true. I grew up in the South hunting with my dad and granddad, deer and squirrel and other things that were unfortunate enough to run in front of us in the woods, which we then ate. I mean, we didn't just do it for sport. And I also say, unfortunately then ate. So I grew up around guns. I was taught gun safety and taught how to shoot guns. It was just, they were always there, and we were always taught to respect guns, and we weren't allowed to be anywhere near them. They were in a locked cabinet if they weren't being used for hunting. Same with, there were a couple handguns in the house. I never even saw them. I knew they existed, but I never saw them. They were always locked away. But I think, to answer your question, Jean, yes, there's absolutely a divide, and there's a very quick way to tell where it exists. It's whether someone talks about a culture of gun violence or someone talks about a culture of gun ownership. Right there's your divide. People who grew up around guns and use them for hunting and other things talk about gun ownership. People who fear guns and don't and think the Second Amendment has been too vigorously interpreted, talk about gun violence. So I think, and I do think you can even see this geographically. I mean, in general, opinion polls suggest coastal elites do not think guns are a necessary thing for people to have in their homes. Move towards the middle, the more red states, you do see, gun ownership rates are higher, and support for the Second Amendment is also higher. That said, I think it's in some ways like the debate that goes on about military versus non-military culture in this country, where you do see this stark divide. It's an economic and class divide. It's an educational divide in some places, not all. But I think it's a very dangerous thing for a democracy when you see a bifurcation that's that stark, where you have entire families for generations never having a single person serve in the military and having no understanding of the military. And I think it's also bad when you have people who think guns are the only way to go, and then they go into a city where there's, gun control law, and they think that's ridiculous. So I think part of the conversation has to be about how do we bridge these divides. And I know I come from a military family. I have these discussions with my in-laws and other people in my family all the time who have no experience in the military. So it's an important discussion to have. When it comes to guns, it's equally important. Now, it's very hard to have any discussion about gun control without it becoming like a crazy flame war. In fact, Intelligence Squared is doing some debate about gun control a couple weeks from now. A friend of mine is going to be in it. And the comments about the announcement of the debate quickly descended into chaos of people calling each other names within 3 or 4 comments because it was about gun control. So if we can find a way to do that, I don't know the answer to how we do that, but I think the first thing is each side has to respect the other's rights to some extent, and you cannot legislate any sort of policy that doesn't treat the other side with respect. We certainly saw this with the government shutdown.
Claire, I want to bring you in, and another thing, as part of this, one of the things that really strikes you when you come from a country where the police are not armed is that, which completely freaked me out when I took my driving test in Boston, where, the guy that got in to do my driving test was an armed policeman. Fortunately, I think because I was English, he just assumed I could drive. But I think, that's another issue as well. Often when people talk about gun control, they're talking about gun control of the people. They're not talking about gun control of the, the state authorities. And you may know that, recently Starbucks announced that they wanted to discourage people from coming into Starbucks in states where it was legal from having, I forget what it's called, but, weapons that you could see. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But they were very clear to point out, except for the police. So I think that's another interesting thing that we can explore, because it seems that when people talk about gun control, they're talking about gun control of the people, and they're not talking about gun control for the police. So let's, maybe you can say what you think about that.
Well, I was just thinking when you were talking about, you know, how alarming it was to see that the police were armed in this country. You would love the Dominican Republic, where the bank guards are carrying sawed-off shotguns with a pistol grip and a shoulder harness. Or Mexico, where every policeman has an automatic weapon that he's carrying at port arms. So in some ways, compared to other countries, we're not that armed. But I would also say, I mean, I grew up in a place not like Christine's, different, in southern Idaho, where everybody had guns too. But they were shotguns and they were rifles. Nobody had handguns. And I think one of the things that is not getting talked about when the debate about guns becomes so bifurcated is why would somebody have a handgun? Under what conditions does that make sense? Under what conditions does that make you feel safe, and why? Because it seems to me that there's a great difference between saying you want to curb the proliferation of guns and simply stop people from owning guns completely. One of the things nobody talks about is how much fun people have with guns. Okay, if you go on the internet and you look at, you know, sort of gatherings where people get together and fire their weapons as families and stuff like that, there's this kind of, you know, adrenaline-fueled fun to doing it. And I think, you know, people have to start talking about why they feel joy in gun ownership, why it's so important to them, and to try and reach across a divide rather than, you know, people just saying, well, it's my right. And because it's my right, I'm going to do it. Because it's my right to wear a gun, I'm going to do that too. I think we need a much more nuanced discussion, and which weirdly I've been having on Facebook with the son of a friend of mine who's a Marine, who's a big deal Second Amendmenter, and he's a good person. And his response to these terrible events is always, if I had been there, I would have helped everyone. And I think that's very meaningful. I think there are a great many people who are gun owners who truly, sincerely believe that if they are armed, they will be in a position to help if something like this happens. And I don't think we can utterly and completely discount that. That being said, let us not forget that, in fact, there is a whole capitalist system at work here selling as many guns, not just in the United States, but around the world, okay, as many guns as they can possibly get out there. Guns are not in Walmart because of the Second Amendment. Guns are in Walmart because there are companies who are making them and selling them. And I guess the final thing I would say is I do think in the United States, and historically this is a long-standing issue, guns are what we might call a fetish object. They are a symbol of something greater than yourself, whether that's freedom, whether that's independence, whether that's strength, whether that's your individualism. They are a fetish object, and I think that I would argue that that has changed in the last 20 years as on YouTube and other kinds of video platforms, you have musical artists, celebrities, and ordinary people who can just take films of themselves with their guns and put them up there playing with their guns.
Nancy.
Well, the thing is, I think we have to realize that there is a divide between the guns in the past and guns right now. I mean, the fact is that guns have become a leisure activity, you know, probably for, you know, en masse for the first time in history. So they're not tools. I mean, there's still tools some places, but people like guns because they're cool and because they're fun to shoot. And, you know, and it's not just men. I mean, where I live in upstate New York, there are a lot of women who absolutely love shooting guns, and so they want to have lots of different kinds of guns. They want to you know, experience shooting handguns and assault rifles and all the rest of it. And because it's a leisure activity, it does have its own kind of subculture. Just to say, doll collecting has its own subculture, but I think that people assume then that somehow people who are enthusiastic about guns have a different attitude to some of these events. And so you can, I've seen debates that degenerate to the point where if someone says, well, I still want guns, another person will reply and say, so you want children to die. When, the fact is that for the vast majority, well, for everyone, really, these events are appalling. And, and gun owners don't support or don't take them lightly any more than anyone else does. So I've forgotten the point I was going to make, but I'll just stop. I'll just leave it there.
Right. Okay. Well, if it comes back to you, then I'll bring you Patrick.
Yeah, I want to agree with the themes I'm hearing. So one thing to kind of keep in mind is the kinds of places where Claire and Christine grew up, and the people who come from those places are being eclipsed in America's demographic trends. So almost all population growth over the next 20 or 40 years is projected to be in America's cities and suburbs, and the rural areas are continued to be expected to lose population. That life and that lifestyle, although it looms large in the American consciousness, is actually declining as the share of Americans who live in those places declines. So, for example, just some data, in the 1970s, if you were in your 30s, you were about 50-50 chance that you owned a gun or there was a gun in your home. Today, people in their 30s, there's only a 1 in 5 chance that there's a gun in your home. And so gun ownership, like cultures of hunting and rural life, is also declining as something that Americans find appealing, as Americans, something that Americans do. And the gun manufacturing industry faces itself with a real problem because it has a declining customer base. And so I think there is a big there's no coincidence that we're seeing sort of a lockstep between gun manufacturers and groups like the NRA trying to change laws to make it easier to carry a concealed weapon, et cetera. In that this is an industry, like any industry, like say cigarettes, that's also facing declining customer bases, that is desperate to figure out how to increase its market share and increase the share of Americans who want to participate in this thing. And changing laws is one way to do it.
Okay, well, there are many more things that we could talk about on the panel, but I do want to bring it out to the audience. So I'm going to take people really quickly, so if you could be concise, and have two people are going to pass the microphones around. So we'll start at the back. I can see a man with his left hand up, and I'm taking him because he's left-handed. The man with the on the back row. I'm left-handed too.
Hi. Check.
Me too.
Well, when you guys were talking about sort of how we frame the issue in mass media and social media, I'd be really interested to know how you guys think people categorize things. I hear a lot of people say that human nature is to categorize things to help understand it. So do you think that's what's at play, or more of a try to rationalize by categorization, if that makes sense?
And I'm going to take a round of questions. And then there were somebody on the back row with you, I think. I can see a lady who's right-handed, but we'll take her anyway.
Thank you.
If you could speak into the microphone.
Sure. Thanks, first of all, for the panelists for being here. This question isn't meant to belittle anyone's ideas about the entire issue, but I've noticed that no one on the panel comes from a minority background, and I think that even though I don't know as much as I should know about this subject, that might be an important thing to speak about gun violence among minorities, especially in the U.S.
Okay, and then the man at the back with the beard, yeah, looks like a Boston Red Sox supporter with that little goatee going on.
Thank you. I'm so happy they won.
I can spot them everywhere.
I just have a general comment, and I just wanted to throw it out there very quickly. Some of the other dimensions that maybe we weren't talked about was, one is demographic. I mean, there are obviously 80 million millennials out there. What we're noticing with a lot of these shootings recently is that it is in that demographic of children that were born in the 80s and the 90s. That's one thing. I slightly disagree with Professor Potter, though, about the mental health aspect of it, because if you look at that Newtown shooter, I believe he was full of pharmaceuticals, and I think another thing that we need to talk about is you know, with the shooter in Arizona, the shooter in the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooting, you know, what sort of psychotropic drugs were they on? How long were they on those drugs? And what are the long-term side effects of those drugs? You know, that's another dimension that we need to look at. The other comment I just want to make too is, like, in terms of discussing, you know, male violence, especially young male violence, you know, way back about 10, 15 years ago, there was a book that my friends and I found laughable called Saving Ophelia. And we found it laughable because it's like, well, where's the male counterpart? Where's Saving Jason? Where's Saving Edward? You know? Also, the other thing from some years ago was Gloria Steinem had a project called Take Our Daughter to Work Day. Well, what about Take Our Son to Work Day? You know? I just kind of feel that there has been this empowerment of young girls while disenfranchising young boys or ignoring the needs of young boys. And I do think that we need, as a society, to start looking at the emotional and psychological needs of boys, because they are very withdrawn. They're very quiet. You can't get to them. You know, you have to find ways to work on their level to see what they're thinking and how they're acting.
Okay, thank you. Keep putting your hands up because I'm going to take a few people. There's a lady there, another left-handed person. See the way to get taken here.
They say that you can judge a society by the way that it takes care of its mentally ill. And the pattern I see is young men who are suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, which comes out in the late teens and early 20s, in Virginia Tech and Colorado and everywhere. And my question is, in the 50s and 60s, many mentally ill people were put in institutions, which granted were hellholes, but then they let them all out of the mental institutions, dumped them on the streets, gave them no help at all. And it seems to me that that's maybe one reason why there are more of these events today. And also, I'm sure there are more guns around today than there were in the 50s and 60s. So if anyone wants to comment.
Okay, lady at the front with her left hand up.
I'm a teacher, so I can probably speak loudly.
Yeah. I just for the recording.
I just want to thank you very much. And when you guys talked about mental health, one thing that I was curious that wasn't mentioned, and I'm wondering if someone might be able to speak about it, is actually just the opinion of mental health and kind of the assumptions that our culture has, whether it just be in the United States. It's one that's very negative. It's one that many parents, you know, myself, don't want that label on their child. They don't want that label on themselves, and this whole idea of labeling under the large umbrella of something that, you know, is a mental health illness is a big issue. And so I'm just wondering if maybe, if you have time, if you could speak on that.
Okay, I'm going to take the man at the front here, and then the lady with the blonde hair behind him, and then I'm going to take Joel, and then I'm going to bring it back to the panel.
Yeah, just a quick point. I hear all the points about mental health and the fact that this, I understand, it seems that everyone seems to think this is totally random. But I do wonder sometimes whether or not, you know, is there something to do with, in society, the way we value human beings today? You know, the fact that you can go into a school and, you know, take the life of all these children. To me, it seems like there's, you know, there's something about an individual with no empathy about other people's lives. I just find that really strange.
Okay, the lady behind you in red.
I want to thank the panel. I was a high school English teacher here in the city and went on to become a school administrator for 30 years in the New York City school system, and then in Rockland County. And just personally, over those 33 years, the amount of students that I've seen has so dramatically increased who are very disenfranchised, who are mentally ill, they're coming from very dysfunctional families. And I think that as a society, if we continue to get bogged down in the issue that we can never win, which is the gun control issue as far as I'm concerned, and start putting our efforts into the bigger picture, which is really what do we do as a culture to address the issues of a very stressed out society that are dealing with tremendous issues of drug abuse and mental health issues. And I think unless we address these families holistically, we are going to see more of this. unfortunately. And I think really the answer is compassion, to speak to what this gentleman is saying. And we need to address it. In the words of the Dalai Lama, if we taught every every 8-year-old to meditate for 1 hour on compassion a week, we could cure the ills of the world in a generation. And I think we have to look at these issues. So,
okay, thank you. Joel.
The gentleman on the end made the point that guns are starting to wane in our society as populations shift. Cigarette smoking as well. You think of all those other sort of vices over time that have sort of waned on their own. And I think a lot of times the buck up for against gun control has more to do with the romance of a dying institution, and it's in its death rattles. And I think we're finding that pushing things ahead really isn't moving us forward as much as it is sort of keeping us framed in yesterday. And I do think that's part of going back to what Christine said earlier about the nuance of finding ways to look at the other side as the other side, not the enemy. All right. I was at Parchman, the Mississippi. Well, they call it a farm, but we know it's a prison. Not too long ago, and it sort of dawned on everybody in the room that Clinton, Mississippi, is now coming up on its 20th year, which in many cases is sort of the first tier of the school shootings. It sort of jumped things off. I think Jonesboro comes up next, and the school in Washington. 20 years, and that shooter survived, and we still know absolutely nothing about what happened. I think this rush to move toward an answer, in a sense, fetishizes these events in ways that put them out of reach, and yet at the same time further muddies up the meaning behind, if meanings exist at all. I think it's interesting that we heard a mention of the Miami Dolphins situation, because obviously there's a lot yet to come out of this. But from what I've gathered in the 24 hours of this news cycle, it's being blamed on one particular ball player, when it seems to me that there is no way somebody in administration didn't know this was happening. It's a failure of leadership on so many different levels, and it's really interesting how we're going to pile on and put a face to this. And in a sense, what it does, it reinforces this idea that you can draw a straight line between masculinity and murder. And I think the more we do that, the more we frame that idea as being part of a really simple equation. We're not simplifying it at all. We're actually making it more complicated than it needs to be.
Okay, I'm going to take the panel to come back in. Please don't feel that you need to answer all of the questions, but I think some of the things that, in particular, I think we should explore a little bit more in addition to the whole issue of mental health and also the media, is the whole issue of masculinity and the disenfranchising of young boys. Because I know myself, I'm invited to all sorts of events about promoting young women, and they're fantastic programs, but I'm never invited to events about giving a leg up, if you like, to young men. And also the point that was made in the front here, which I think is very important, about how we value human beings. What does it say about someone who can go into any place, not just a school, which is like the most extreme example, but go into a place where they don't know the people and then randomly just shoot everybody and then either shoot themselves or allow themselves to be shot by the police. So who wants to go first? I have Nancy, who's chafing at the bit here. Nancy.
Well, the week before last, there was a press release where they actually have got the tox screens back from Adam Lanza. My understanding is that he didn't have anything in his system. They tested for everything, and there were no drugs in his system. So it just kind of deepens the mystery, in one sense, of why, what drove him to commit the acts that he did. I mean, I'm concerned about masculinity, but for a different reason. What concerns me is our tendency to pathologize masculinity, and so I'm a mother with 2 boys, And so I've followed discussions, not just about, do you let boys play with guns, but also discussions about rape, where you have this kind of worried discussion about, how do I teach my son that no means no? And how do I teach my son, not to be hyper-masculine? And I think the problem is that I think we have a tendency to project our adult understandings of things onto kids. And what's happened is that we end up giving young boys the message that to be who they are is not okay. And the best example of this is the question of toy guns, because we have kind of a natural experiment that took place in the UK where they decided that they were going to ban toy guns in all the preschools and with young children, which they did. And what they did, I guess it was maybe 7, 8 years later, is they reversed that decision, because what they found was that kids who were, acting out, or boys who were acting out and playing with guns, and were not, were not particularly violent. It was just the way that they played. Were constantly being told that, no, you can't do this. No, this is not okay. And it actually became a problem because boys had more problems managing their emotions and being able to develop the ability to interact with other people in a normal way. So I think we have to be very, very careful about the way that we look at masculinity and the way, particularly that we operate with children. Just on the question of mental illness and stigma, I think it's ironic because it seems to me that in one sense we've had an expansion of the definition of mental illness, particularly over the last 20, 30 years, so that anything from being defiant to being shy is become something that we can medicate for. So we've had that on the one hand, where we tend to sort of see normal behaviors, particularly among children, in a pathological way, in a medicalized way. But at the same time, it's also very, very difficult to be able to get people who genuinely are mentally ill the care that they need. And I hope that's changing. I think there have been some very good efforts by people, particularly over the last couple of years, to show what a sort of Kafkaesque system we have for trying to help people who are mentally ill in a serious way. But the problem is that when everyone has some sort of pathology, how is it that you can then focus on the people who really could be a danger to themselves and to others?
Patrick.
Yeah, I'll speak to 2 points. I think first, just to say a little bit about people of color and guns and gun ownership. We certainly know that African Americans continue to be victims of gun violence and homicide generally at much higher rates than the rest of the population. But what's important to note is that in terms of gun ownership, people of color are much less likely to own guns than whites. And that's because of the rural-urban divide. People of color tend to live in urban and suburban areas compared to whites who tend to be more likely to live in rural areas than non-whites. And so this is all part of the shift in culture and demographics, that we have this kind of interesting bifurcation right now where the people who are most benefiting, at least in terms of the folks who are not in jail, people who are most benefiting from the decline in crime rates are people of color in low-income and middle-income urban neighborhoods. But these are also people who are most unlikely to own guns themselves. So it's a very interesting story that's different than the story that you're hearing from gun enthusiasts who are promoting the expansion of gun rights in other parts of the country. So I'll just say that. And the other piece I'll say about masculinity is we have to kind of keep in mind structural changes in the American economy that are, I would say, essentially making it not very, masculinity doesn't pay anymore, literally. So that the kinds of places where we're seeing growth in employment are the kinds of sectors where the sorts of traits that we associate with traditional masculinity aren't very helpful to you in a career. So we're seeing, for example, in service sectors, both low end and high end, women are now the majority of law students. They're now the majority of medical students. And we can only expect to see those kinds of things increase as the kinds of traits that lead to success in those sorts of professions and fields are those that we traditionally associate, and falsely, it's just a fake thing, what's femininity, what's masculinity, right? But that are traditionally associated with women and not with men. So I think part of the story here is that men who exhibit traditionally masculine traits increasingly find themselves locked out of a culture that is willing to pay them for the kinds of work that was once associated with those kinds of traits.
Claire. Wow, there's a lot on the table. I think one thing I'd like to say at the beginning, I think what you were talking about around the study of giving children toy guns was interesting. To put it a little more bluntly, I don't think people should give children toy guns because guns aren't toys. I mean, when I was growing up, actually, you learned gun safety, you learned to handle real guns, and nobody gave children toy guns in southern Idaho because you didn't want children to confuse toy guns with real guns. And I think if, in fact, we can't control the proliferation of guns in this country, and we can, and, a lot of people buy guns and they just forget they have them. So a lot of young people who are killed by guns are killed by a gun that actually nobody's paid attention to in years, that they have found somewhere, and, pop goes the weasel. So I actually think we need to start dealing with some realities about teaching children gun safety, and I think there are parent groups who are really doing that. I want to come back to this question of masculinity because I don't think we should confuse, first of all, we shouldn't think masculinity is one thing, and we shouldn't confuse masculinity with the actual state of being a man. There's actually a wonderful book that is the equivalent to Raising Ophelia called Raising Cain, which is about how boys grow up and become emotionally mature human beings. And one of the things that the authors of this book talk about are that boys are actually open and loving with each other up until about age 14 or 15, and then they shut down. And one of the things the study shows is that most boys are lonely. And they are lonely because they are told that it's not okay to be intimate with other boys unless you're a fag. And all of the gay marriage and all of the anti-homophobic training and so on does not make it normal for kids to be gay in school. There's a tremendous amount of homophobia in schools, and a lot of it is directed at boys. Okay, so one of the things these psychologists found was it wasn't being a man, it wasn't masculinity, it was a particular model of masculinity that associated manhood with being reserved and unloving, okay? And there used to be a number of feminist men, Michael Kimmel, John Stoltenberg, who talked about what it would mean to be a different kind of man. A kind of man who was empathetic, who could be intimate and loving with other men. And I think we need to start having those conversations. I am relatively unconvinced that boys are, despised and loathed by the society. There's no evidence I can see that sexism has suddenly turned on its heel and women are oppressing men now. I just don't see it. But I do think that, for example, when you're talking about the football team, there was a great story in the New York Times today in which the reporter talked about the culture of abuse of younger football players on teams. This happens at the professional level, it happens in college, it happens in high school, and it's not just that the coaches know about it, it's that they encourage it and they think it's good. Okay, so I actually think we need to look at the institutions in which boys are discovering themselves as human beings, as civic agents, and say, what exactly are the messages we're sending to them? Are we saying survival of the fittest, which is basically what happened on the Miami Dolphins? Are we saying if you have a best friend, you must be a fag? Because actually those are the messages that boys are hearing, and they're not hearing them from women. They're hearing them from men.
Okay, I'm going to bring Christine in. So have your questions and comments ready. Christine.
I want to see if I can tie a couple of the very good questions together. On the issue of minorities, and on the issue, I think actually it speaks to a broader issue which Claire brought up at the very beginning, which is incarceration rates in this country. And I think it's worth remembering that, you know, people quote Tocqueville and Democracy in America all the time, but a lot of people forget that he first came to the U.S. to study our prison system. And in the process of studying our prisons, he taught us a lot about what democracy's strengths and weaknesses are. So I think a lot of the conversation about violence and gun violence, and whether it's a conversation about minorities or other institutions, we need to talk about how we punish and how whether or not we need to reform the way we sentence nonviolent criminals, for example, because much of this goes back to some of a theme that's been popping up here and there in this discussion, which is the most central institution for helping people form a stable sense of self: the family, the community, the neighborhood, just these small local communities where, as much as we might want government policymakers to help, and they can help to some extent, we're talking about unstable families and what we do about that, and incarceration rates in this country definitely contribute to that instability, and particularly in minority communities. To the issue of masculinity, which has been really fascinating to listen to this, I think, in fact, that Claire and Pat agree more than they disagree about this, because what Pat was saying about the kinds of work that in the future will be rewarded are more feminine style working styles. I do think that although no one would say sexism is on the decline, if you look at the institutions that train us for that future, for example, the school system, they do train worker bees who are much more, who are good at sitting still, who don't get up and want to move around, who can focus on filling out worksheet after worksheet after worksheet. And some boys can do this, and I have to, full disclosure, I'm running like a major social science experiment at home because I have fraternal twin 7-year-old boys, and they are total opposites. One's very sporty, like the traditional boy thing, and the other one's not. He just likes different things, and they're being raised the same way, and so it's kind of fun. And they have very different experiences at school. They're in second grade. They have very different experiences every day. Part of that's the way the totalizing institution of education treats them. But they are being trained, the ones who can sit still and do all that work and dot every I and cross every T are rewarded now. I think it's worth questioning whether that's the kind of democratic citizen we want in the future, because they're taught to obey and color in the lines, and I, for one, think we need more people who are willing to scribble outside of them. But so there's the sort of conformist thing about our total institutions. And the issue of millennials and mental health that was a great question, because I think, I'm a Gen Xer, so everyone just forgets about us. We're just annoying. But the millennials, this is the future, right? We've had, reams of paper expended on how the millennials, with all their connecting and good works, are going to transform society. And no one talks about the ones, the fact that many of them have spent their lives on Ritalin and then transfer into Adderall when they get to college, and what a lifetime of self-medicating or being medicated by one's parents teaches them about their sense of self and whether they're good enough and whether they can do anything on their own. I think that question is hugely important here, especially when, as you pointed out, some of the recent shooters have come from exactly that generation, and we're getting help for their problems. But how we define what a problem is in that context is a discussion we're not having often enough.
Can I come back on that?
Yes, quickly, and then I'm going to go out.
I mean, I think that no one would argue that women are no longer oppressed, but I think that men have lost status, and I think that it's useful to take the view of looking back over the post-war period and understanding that period as a period of incredible pressure to conform. And so it was the case. I think that, women had very rigid roles and men had very rigid roles, and it was hard to deviate from that. And so we've reacted against that. But I think that what we've done is we've almost kind of thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And so, to exhibit any of the old traits that were associated with the old kind of rigid masculinity, I think those are now problematized, and I think it makes it very difficult for boys. And I mean, I have to say, I've talked to mothers and fathers of kids with boys around the country, and the most The funniest thing is that I do think that most boys will find a way to play with guns. I mean, I was talking to someone who was describing to me how his parents wouldn't let them have guns, and so they made guns with their underwear and rubber bands. I have no proof of this, but speaking to people in the UK, speaking to people in different parts of the country here, it does seem to be a kind of universal thing. But I don't think that we should assume that kids, when they are playing with guns, are confusing that with real guns any more than they confuse cartoon violence with real violence.
Okay, I'm going to come out to the audience for another round, and if anybody has any thoughts, particular in terms of what's new about what's going on now, what's driving this narcissistic behaviour, and if we can draw any lessons in terms of contemporary US society. So everybody, put your hand up. I have a man here on the second row next to the teacher.
I have a question about controlling guns. I think it would be logical to control the type of guns that are sold. I understand that it's sort of capitalism that's driving it, but I think the shooter in Newtown could have been limited by the damage he did had he not been able to, or had he not had access to the type of gun he had. And so I realized that it's kind of fun, but I think, and this kind of speaks to the point you made about the police and the military having certain types of guns, why can't we control them too? But I don't think citizens should have access to automatic rifles and assault rifles. I think there's a place and a time, and I respect the hunting and that sort of thing. So I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
Okay, Alan.
I am fascinated that we're here in New York, and we haven't heard as much. I was expecting to hear a lot more people be outraged with the whole gun thing. When we were in Europe, and many of the conversations I have with people in New York get very, very nasty in the way that Christine was pointing out, because what seems to happen is that we talk about people who they want to have guns. It's almost like those people that are a bit like almost like a race apart. They're the ones that drive SUVs and they shoot people, and there's this discussion about that's the kind of person. And actually, when we think about how people talk about people generally today, it's often how we talk about people that we can't trust them. They're a bad bunch. They're a bad lot. And I'm particularly interested in the idea about the state and why it is that police and the army are trusted, and when we have a discussion about people, often we're not. Because everyone's talking about mental health tonight, as though that issue about how we talk about people in America isn't really there. And I do think that there is a big culture war that goes on, that somehow, and it's often about people in the Midwest and the South, and they're not quite as cosmopolitan as the people on the East and the West Coast, and they're where the problem is. But then when we get onto the discussion of mental health, I think it's really ironic that people are saying people aren't talking about mental health much, because I agree with Nancy's point, because it seems to me today that everything's therapeutised. In fact, we're a mad, bad bunch. And actually, if you think about everything from summer camp where kids are going on there, where almost like 60 or 70% of them are getting prescribed drugs now because there's no more authority in the classroom and on camps with adults and children, or just more generally where all our behaviour wants to be pathologised and therapeutised, the discussion of mental health seems to be everywhere. So it seems to me that with this particular discussion, there's a lot of different things that inform it, but there's a couple of very basic things. These random acts that we see are just that. Don't look for any meaning there. There is none. Nihilistic, empty of meaning. The search for meaning is our own attempt to pursue the unknowable. They're shocking and they're outrageous and they're terrible. And, there's nearly 300 million guns in America. If it was really the case, and I agree with Patrick's point, that this was such an enormous problem, everyone would be killing everyone all the time. Now, if you speak to people in Europe, they think that's what's happening here quite a lot. There are places like Brazil and South Africa where it is, per capita, a really significant issue for very particular reasons. But in the States, I don't happen to think it is. But I think they're random acts. What's really fascinating is how the so-called political acts now are identical to those random, absolutely devastatingly shocking and terrible acts by individuals. So what teenagers are doing and what so-called political people are doing, empty of meaning. So I think we should just step back and say, we can't make any meaning from it. We shouldn't give it as much press attention that we do. There is no meaning. It's sad and it's shocking and it's terrible. But also when it becomes a discussion about what do we think about our fellow people, for the most part, I think we can have trust in them. I actually support the right for people to own their own guns. Actually, I actually trust people more, as it happens, than I do the state and the police and the army. If you look historically back, often, you know, particularly America's example of why it is independent, it was because ordinary people had guns. I mean, if you're in Egypt in Tahrir Square, perhaps you'd want them there too.
Okay, thank you. The man behind you.
Well, actually, he kind of covered what I wanted to ask. Someone had mentioned nihilism earlier, and I was wondering if anyone cared to expound on that in terms of the effect in the general culture.
Okay, I want to take another few people before I bring the panel back. The man on the back row.
Thank you very much. I've heard the panel and a lot of talk today about what could be the potential cause of the violence. So I heard, is it a mental health issue? Is it a gun control issue? If we got rid of guns, would this solve the problem? If we took care of the mentally sick, would it take care of the problem? And there's only really one thing that I'd like to hear more about, is that those are just band-aids, it appears to me. If we got rid of guns, I still believe we would have people who are depressed, the way the shooters have been, crying out in certain ways. And if we threw everybody into the loony bin again, or medicated everybody so they would be more docile and commit less crime, I don't believe that would be the solution. It just seems obvious to me over the years. I'm also a Gen Xer, so I've been looking at this kind of thing for a while. Every single person who's committed a crime of this degree, they all seem to be very, very closed in and very depressed individuals. And they're all men, or young men. And what I believe is the cause of it is that yes, there is something about masculinity that needs to be addressed. That one is that men are no longer being led with proper role models. And it's kind of contradictory because as children, boys are told to shut up, be a man, just don't talk about your feelings, you got to be very stoic. And at the same time, as they're growing up through adolescence, they don't have that conduit, social network where they could talk about things that are troubling them. And these men are holding it in, and they start to get upset at the world, and then they explode, they snap, and then they start shooting people. And I think that's where the problem is. So I believe that boys, when they're growing up, need to be nurtured a little bit more. Two, I believe, yes, there is a bit of less attention for promoting boys, giving them advantages, a leg up in life. We see a lot of images of successful women, leadership, encouraging little girls to become very intelligent and successful, but at the same time, men are taught that we're not as smart as they are. And we watch sitcoms where the men are bumbling idiots that can't make a decision, and the smart women in their lives treat them like children and figure everything out for them. And these are the images that people see as they grow up in mass media, and that is really what I feel is the cause of the problem, is that men are no longer taught to be men, and we're only using one form of man, as you mentioned, is the stoic Marlboro man smoking cigarettes, carrying a shotgun. They may not be the ideal, but a man that's able to express himself, who's comfortable with himself, and is able to communicate the things that they're going through. If we got to the root of that, I believe we would lessen this type of violence that's been happening. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to take, there was a lady indicating here next to the lady who has a scarf that matches one of the pictures, actually.
Thank you. Gosh, I've had so many different thoughts as everyone. It's a problem with being one of the last people to speak. But I guess it's going to sound funny, but I actually realized I wanted to thank you all for organizing this as a conversation and allowing people to participate. And it's going to sound funny, but I was thinking as we were talking, I think we're living in a society where actually conversation isn't even that easy. I mean, it's hard to do. I mean, we've talked about particular issues like gun control and masculinity, but it's kind of across the board. I mean, I think we've learned the way we even know how to converse is kind of heated, and it can be almost anything. And I guess I was thinking about it because I happen to actually, I've spent a lot of time over the last 30 years working with people who've devoted quite a bit to creating new kinds of approaches to these various issues. But I guess I wanted to just ask about how the panelists and people in the audience think about how we're going to develop socially and individually. How are we going to create new hopes, new possibilities? Because, we're living in a time, and I think it's Nancy who was talking about it being a crisis of institutions, where, the majority of us don't view government, for example, as being as being capable of bringing about social transformation. Christine was talking about schools, which are absolutely more and more just kill creativity. And I kind of want to advocate for creativity because I think we need far more creative responses to these things, because people don't, and to the gentleman saying, how do we look at human beings? Well, there's many ways to address that, but at a minimum, we're not particularly viewed or view ourselves as capable of creating anything new. And I think that, if anything, to me, has been one of the more damaging and, if you will, violent consequences of the way that we've kind of developed as a culture and a society. And I don't think just in the U.S. I think internationally, sadly, I think Western culture is dominated. But anyway, I just kind of wanted to throw that
yes,
into
well,
the mix.
I always like to end on a hopeful note. So I'm going to bring the panel back to respond. But just before, as always in these discussions, it raises more questions that we want to pursue. So I hope you will all join us for a drink afterwards in forgotten the name of the place, Pam? The name of the place? Oh, yes, the Grape and Vine on 13th Street between 5th and 6th. So I hope you will all come afterwards. So, but hold on a second, because I'm going to bring all of the panel in to speak, and I'm going to bring in Claire first because she's
jumping out of her
just
skin.
so eager.
Okay, I just want to start by saying I understand there's a big conversation about how downtrodden men are. But women are not running this country. You can read the New York Times sports section for days and never find a female athlete on it. So I absolutely reject it that the crisis in masculinity is being caused by the fact that, men are not getting opportunities, men are disliked for being men don't have role models, and so on. I would really ask you, there are reasons why certain kinds of social changes occur. One of the reasons, I do agree that all children need to be nurtured, okay? I agree with that profoundly. One of the reasons children are not being nurtured is that we are putting tremendous pressure on families economically now, all right? The state of this country has been to force everybody in every social class to work harder except for the 1%. So middle-class families and upper-middle-class families are often the last people to know that their children are in trouble because they don't really see them. They're at work, okay? I think the other thing we need to think about in terms of this, and somebody was mentioning nihilism, okay? There are not enough venues to articulate values to children. The values in this society currently are doing well on your tests, and you are tested constantly in school. No wonder all these kids go and shoot up schools. Schools are horrifying now. I think the conversation about creativity is really important. Children are not being nurtured in school. But there are things we could change. We could end standardized testing. We could actually put pressure on corporations to pay people fair wages so that they don't have to work 3 jobs in order to keep the family together. There have been dramatic social changes that are associated with the concentration of money at the top and the turning of schools into factories to produce a certain kind of worker. And yes, it exactly produces a kind of nihilism and a sense that there aren't any values that a kid can identify with.
Okay, Christine.
I agree with a lot of that. I think there's a term that was floating around in the early 20th century that I think might be better than nihilism, and it was enemy. And this was this sense of identity drift is kind of the best way to describe it. This was used to describe people who just didn't know who they were. They had no developed sense of self. It was obviously it's a very broad brushstroke kind of idea, but in some ways I think that might help us get to this question of self and identity and why we are in a culture where, despite all the opportunities that kids have these days, there is this disconnection. Despite being the most connected technologically in the world, there is that lack of context for a lot of these kids, I think, growing up. And this is true across the economic spectrum, I have to say. If you talk to child psychologists who deal with extremely, kids from extreme poverty and kids from extreme wealth, a lot of the problems are similar in terms of this development of a core sense of self. I'm a big almost Luddite tech skeptic, and that's how I spend most of my time, is being a tech skeptic. But I have to give one plug to answer the gentleman's question about aren't there solutions. For guns, there is a technological solution that we could very quickly and rapidly embrace as a society that would solve some of the accidental deaths caused by guns, certainly. And that's a device. You can wear a band, and it sends a radio frequency to your gun. It's related to your palm print. You pick up that gun, you get a green light. You can fire that gun. You drop the gun, someone else picks it up, they cannot fire the gun. They hand it back to you, you can fire it right again, you don't even have to. So there is technology, there's a German company already manufacturing these guns. We could do this. We could solve this practical problem. But I think, as the gentleman was saying in the back there, it's not an entirely practical problem. It's also a philosophical and political one. The only other thing I wanted to get back to an earlier point about, your point actually, about should we be more concerned about citizens being armed or the state being armed? I think that is something we didn't touch on a lot in this debate, but it's a very core part of Americans' identity, for good and ill. But this idea that much of our founding came out of the ability of citizens to stand up to the state and say no. There is an ethos there. There is a sensibility there about negative liberty versus positive liberty, about whether you have freedom for or freedom against. I mean, these are important concepts to Americans. And when we had this discussion in London, ironically, it was a British man on the panel at the time who gave this vigorous defense of the American Constitution, much to the one day after the government shutdown had ended, to the appalled stares of the British audience. But we really appreciated that. We were sort of applauding him. But I do think that we should, again, that's a very 30,000-foot philosophical question, but it's important when it comes to this debate or any debate about liberty in this country.
Thank you. Nancy?
Just a couple of quick points. Or maybe they're not that quick. I think we should be careful about the assumptions that we make about parents and kids now. In fact, parents now spend more time with their kids, even though both men and women work in most families. If it's a couple, they spend more time with their kids than they did in the 1960s. It's counterintuitive, but because of the way that parenting culture is developed, that's something that parents are very, very engaged with their kids, maybe too engaged with their kids. I was on masculinity and women and our women benefiting at the expense of men. I really think that's the wrong way to look at it. I think that what's happened is that we have a crisis of authority, all authority, in our society. And the fact is that in the past, men personified that authority. So what has happened is that men have suffered from that. The way that we view masculinity now has to do with the way that we view authority, and it's affected individual men. But the really horrible thing about it is that women are not benefiting from this. I mean, it may appear to some people that women are doing better, but I think everyone is doing worse. Because you need to be able to have a kind of common set of ideas on which to operate your society and politics. And when everything is up for grabs, men as well as women suffer. And then I was really glad that someone raised the point, I think it was the lady back there, about what we can do about this. And one of the things that we haven't mentioned is that unfortunately in the wake of these events, I think that there's a tendency now to institutionalize mistrust, and this is certainly true in the schools. In my own kids' school, 2 days after Newtown, they completely revamped their security measures so that parents were no longer really welcome at the school. And so the assumption became that people outside the school, parents and the community, are a problem. And whether the people in the school felt like that or not, they put up these barriers, sometimes physical barriers, other times barriers, bureaucratic barriers, so that it destroyed the basis of trust between the community and people. And so, I think in a climate like that, that is how mentally ill women whose cars drive at the White House can be killed in this way, is that we, have made a barrier between people. And I think this is a real problem because, one of the really sad things about the United States is that I don't think we are very good at dealing with one another and with resolving disputes. And it seems silly, but if you talk to people, you find that people are afraid to confront their neighbors because they're making too much noise. And so, rather than go up and talk to their neighbor, they want to go to the housing association, or they want to go to the city and they want to make a complaint. And if we are too intimidated by the idea of engaging with other people, well, of course, I think this is a problem, and I think that's the problem more than the fact that people have guns.
Patrick, I'm going to give you the last word.
All right, thanks. It's been great being here, and it's been a night, I think, when I've had a lot to agree with in term with the other members of the panel, but I want to close actually by heartily disagreeing with the rhetoric of crisis that I'm hearing from the room and also from the table. And I think the rhetoric of crisis is kind of remarkable given that the data we have to work with is all positive or in the positive direction. So there's no discernible increase in mass shootings. There is a discernible decrease in gun violence and gun deaths, and there is a discernible great decrease in gun ownership. And the fact that we've gone from that data to a rhetoric of crisis, I think, says something more about how we like to talk about these problems than about the solutions to them. So I'll say one more thing, and Jean had asked for a little bit of optimism, so let me give you a little bit of optimism, which is about millennials. If you want to know about millennials, don't hold forth about them, don't pontificate about them. Why don't you survey them? Because when you survey them, you find out things like they have the highest level of trust in government of any generation in American politics right now. They have higher levels of participation in politics, in voting, et cetera, of any generation at that age. Okay? Their levels of social tolerance, whether it's on gender, race, sexual orientation, is higher than any other generation so far. Their levels of optimism about the future are higher than any generation, especially us old fuddy-duddies sitting up here at the table. And also, what's that?
Speak for yourself.
No, all right, sure. I'm the fuddy-duddy, sure. That just, if you think about, if you just look at item after item about what millennials say about their lives and about this country, this is a generation that is not in crisis compared to my generation, the Gen X generation, when we just sat back and we certainly did have anomie. So what I want to encourage folks to do is to think about what is appealing about the rhetoric of crisis that leads us to this place, and I think a lot of these conversations end up in this place. And I want instead for you to just always question that move that we want to make, and I'm there with you. There's something appealing about this rhetoric, and instead to look at facts and data to discern whether that's actually the case.
Okay, thank you. Please join me in thanking the panel. And thanks again to the New School and to all of the New School volunteers. And I hope you'll all join us for a drink now so we could carry on the conversation.